Alrighty then. Welcome back to another Division 2 build video. I am Relentless, and today we are going over more or less the new Sleigher SMG. Now, there are multiple different facets when it comes to trying to make a build with this, what I would call a novelty weapon. Now, the obvious of choices, since it is an SMG, you can basically throw it on any SMG build, with the exception of a clutch build. And the reason I say that is primarily because of the lower, I'd say really low RPM at only 250. But girl, I will handle you in a minute. Why do you really have to come stand right in front of me? I know you have a nice looking badonkadonk, and you know you were pretty fly last night when it all bare naked. But anyways, I am trying to do a build video, so can we get with all this shenanigans and hanky panky later? You don't have to sit here and entice me while I'm trying to do a build video. But okay, you want to ignore me? All right, well we'll see if you ignore me later on tonight. Anyways, sorry guys for that interruption. I'm gonna have to go in here so I'm not enticed or trolled by my queen out there, you know. Just don't tell Mendoza. Especially right now, since the hit registration is not responding properly with the SMG, and I will flip on you over to a clip demonstrating that. It was actually pretty frustrating, but actually quite comical and expect from Ubisoft when it comes to, you know, rushing out things, especially from the likes of a part-time, on-time, whatever time janitor. But anyways, I'm gonna send you over to the clip. But as you can see, it definitely can register consistently if the registration would actually work properly at 90k with what setup I have here, which is in a PvP scenario, 440.6k armor, 130k health, which is my values on these pieces aren't exactly, you know, the greatest, but with just minimum effort, getting those stats, it is pretty easily to achieve properly. And the further your target is, instead of more or less a slanting bullet drop like typical real guns do and other games do, this game does not have any kind of bullet drop in it. You can notice that if you use any of the rifles and marksman rifles, but more or less this particular weapon, you can kind of look at it as bullet drop off, but it's more of an arcing curve, and the further you are away, it can get really severe, as you can see. So it's you can look at it as a rifle, but anything beyond that right there is going to be useless, and it's more or less going to be able and be more useful with like the mid-range and up close. So you're going to have really high base damage to really get any effect out of it if you plan on utilizing it more or less along the lines of a DPS build. And speaking of DPS builds, this is more or less the concept, one concept and variation that you can actually go with and try to utilize it. Now, as far as PvP, PvE situations, the only differences basically is when it comes to the different build methods when it comes to those particular two type things is just damage to elites. So you can take any build that you see, incorporate damage to elites, and bam, you have a PvE build. And if you work it right, and you don't want to have to more or less sit there and switch builds every time you want a PvE and then switch again when you go to PvE, you can build it in a way and in a manner that will work for both PvE or PvP. You can see that on a lot of my build videos on my channel. But since it is an SMG, it synergizes well with the Suck Me Off brand set, and the Suck Me Off brand set for one piece gives you 10% SMG damage. And just so happens that that same brand set, its perfect talents that's on that brand set is Perfectly Wicked. And Perfectly Wicked is when you apply a status effect, gain 20% weapon damage for 20 seconds. So essentially, by the baked in, I wouldn't say baked in, the attributes that was rolled on it, 12% SMG damage, plus that's 32% weapon damage. And if the hit registration would actually work properly, then that's 32% weapon damage after you just shoot them in the noggin once. Now, If they have hazard protection on, then it's not going to, proc the talent that is on the confuse every 20 seconds. But that confuse is a status effect. Now, the other variation or way and method you can actually go about it is it will proc the BTS U-Gloves. So for you skill builds out there, if you want to utilize this, then it will actually proc your BTS U-Gloves for you. No longer will you have to actually, throw one skill in order to proc another, or, however you was doing it before. You could essentially land one shot to their noggin and proc your BTS U-Gloves, and boom, you're in business. But that's more or less for the skill build side of things. But when it comes to DPS DPS variations of it, you have to treat it as more or less a rifle. And what I mean by that, because it only has 250 RPM, and that is more or less consistent and along the lines of the rifles. The Classic M1A, 180 RPM. The Police MK17, 275 RPM, that's probably the closest out of any of the weapons in RPMs when it comes to the comparison between this gun. Now, the rifles will have range, but essentially in PvP, most people will try to sit there and face tank with a rifle up close and personal. Now, when it comes to the rifles, they have to pull the trigger for each bullet that they fire. Good thing about this, if it goes up against another rifle build, that you can just hold down the trigger, and that's without me controlling any kind of recoil whatsoever. So you can just hold it down for all 50 rounds with a minimal effort in which to control the recoil, because there's essentially really not any. So in that aspect, it could actually, up close and personal, close range, it actually will be better if you directly in comparison with a rifle. So the more damage you can stack on as far as offensive mods and the attribute rolls on pieces, and as you can see up here, I've incorporated the Merciless, so that way I can proc it with Spark, but you don't necessarily want to handcuff yourself and utilize the Merciless as your secondary, just because both weapons are going to have really low RPMs. And if you want to completely, spec into that route and, have it both ways, she did up there. But anyways, then you can change out, like, for instance, on the screen, the two-piece True Patriot for the likes of, let's say, the Overlord armaments. Because one piece will give you that 10% rifle damage, and then the two pieces will give you the 7.5% total armor, and you can incorporate two-piece Overlord instead of two-piece True Patriot. Yes, you're going to lose 2.5% total armor, but that's minuscule in comparison, especially if you want to utilize both for like a mid-longer range and the Merciless, and then, up close and personal with the likes of this particular SMG. But treating them both as the same. But, if you want to, in personal opinion, I'd probably rather go with the likes of like the Pestilence or let's say the Eagle Bearer, so that way when you're shooting your primary, then you're at least gaining some kind of benefit from your holstered talent or whatever weapon you're utilizing, such as a 10% bonus armor while you're shooting your primary, like that is found on the Eagle Bearer. You can even go with the route of the Chatterbox, because after a kill, reload, and then you get that burst of RPM, which is I mean, I wouldn't really recommend it in this situation. They are both SMGs, but I think there's other, more viable options. And to be really honest with you, if you had your choice to utilize any other weapon in the game besides this, then you're going to choose that, unless you just want to go out there and have fun and basically have a snowball fight with all your mates, because essentially that's what it's all boils down to. It's a novelty weapon, just to go out and try to have fun with, something different, something unique to try out, to mess around with, or as I would call it, a distraction, amongst other things, because of the delay in the raid that we was supposed to already have gotten. And I think it's a cool concept, but they could have made it so much better. As far as Snowball, you would think I would rather have lower base damage but a lot higher RPM, because the Tommy gun that's already in the game already has, not quite as low RPM. But, if they had made it along the lines of, let's say, the same rate of fire as the MP5, or really souped it up so it would spit out rounds, but then, actually give it a little bit more recoil than those, but yet still shoot out these little mini snowballs, I think that would have been so much cooler, so much more that you could actually utilize it. And they could have made it to where the RPM, instead of like one headshot, they could have made it just like any other talent, like Ignited or any of those eyeless, so that way, it just has a chance to, throw confusion on them as a status effect. Or you could put it like, land 5 headshots and then apply the status effect. So, I mean, the concept is cool, but the implementation of it, as always when it comes to Ubisoft, is a little lackluster. It looks cool concept as far as the implementation and actually it working right and actually something viable to actually use, and it actually really, really failed on that part. But the recommendation for you to actually utilize this weapon, if it's a must and you just want to try it out, I would either go with the BTSU gloves in a skill build just to proc the gloves itself. But in the DPS variation, just go with the likes of Wicked. You don't have to use a Merciless. I don't really recommend it. Just any other weapon, because you don't want to completely gimp yourself and more or less handcuff yourself to just having 2 very low RPM without any kind of variation in your gameplay. You're more or less just one-sided, and believe it or not, you're going to get smacked up and down. It's definitely if you try to PvP with this particular weapon. But as you've seen in the gameplay, you can achieve really, really high damage, 90k, and that is, PvP side of it. And as far as when it comes to the likes of PvE, just add damage to elites, and that's, you can go and try to inflict it. It does work out pretty decently on some heavies, especially if you're roaming around the LZ. But other than that, it's kind of less a bust. But this is just one concept that I more or less threw together, just to give you one interpretation or variation when it comes to trying to utilize this particular weapon in any kind of build for PvP. But as always, thank you guys so much for tuning in. We appreciate all the love and support. We'll see you fudging later.